True leadership begins when you unlock the brilliance of the mind and lead with the resonance of the heart. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Uncaged Leaders. I'm Mariquita Solis, the Uncaged Heart Coach. Today, we're diving into a conversation that challenges us to look deeply at the cultural scripts that we've been handed. So sit back, because this is specifically today around sex, power, and what it means to be a man. My guest today argues that if we want to understand the deep-seated sexism and the racism running through modern pornography, we have to look at the radical feminist critique. So joining me today is Robert Jensen, Emeritus Professor in the School of Journalism and Media at the University of Texas at Austin. Robert is a profound voice on these topics, having authored essential books like Getting Off, Pornography and the End of Masculinity, and the End of Patriarchy, Radical Feminism for Men. He also has a highly anticipated new book coming out this September called This I Don't Believe, A Fulfilling Life Without Meaning. Perhaps too many men fear feminism, when in reality, Bob will discuss why radical feminism is a gift to men. It's a vital framework that helps us dismantle the most destructive elements of patriarchy, so we can finally build relationships rooted in real respect and radical compassion. So thanks for joining me today, Bob.
Well, Mariquita, it's lovely to be here and good to talk about these subjects.
Yeah, it's essential, and this can be a very heated topic and something that is of discomfort, but these things they can't stay in the closet. We have to look at these things rationally and with not only logic, but heart. Hey, Daniel Broccoli, thanks for joining us. I see he's here. And so let's dive into this. So I'd love to hear first about how did pornography, what is the history of pornography?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between the human creative impulse to explore sexuality, which has been with us, I assume, as long as we've had a creative impulse. I used to always say, when we run into the limits of our kind of rational minds to understand something, we move to art. And I always say that's why there's so much art about God and so much art about sex, because we don't really understand either God or sex. So it's not surprising that you will see representations of the body and sexuality in art. But the modern pornography industry is quite different. It's not a creative exploration of sexuality. It's a way to sell objectified female bodies primarily to men for sexual pleasure. It's what I would call one of the sexual exploitation industries, along with prostitution, escorts, massage parlors, strip bars. All of these are ways in the modern world that men buy and sell women's bodies for sexual pleasure. And pornography is one of those. Of course, as technologies have changed, the pornography industry has changed. And in fact, pornography has often been a leader in figuring out how to exploit new technologies. So in some sense, the 20th century with photography and film and eventually, video and the computer is the story of the pornography industry colonizing each of those technologies to the point today that we, as everyone who wants to know knows, virtually anyone, including children, have round-the-clock access not only to sexually explicit images, but sexually explicit images of incredible degradation, cruelty, usually degradation and cruelty aimed at women. And that's where we sit today. So sometimes people will say to me, well, there are cave paintings from 40,000 years ago about the human body. Okay, fine. If you're telling me that the social effect of a cave painting 40,000 years ago of a human body is similar to, a 12-year-old boy sitting in front of a computer watching women being strangled while sexually violated, well, I think we can see that those are quite different experiences.
Definitely. And what was your experience like? Let me, as a young boy, when I grew up let me just say, as a young girl, it was joked about. I saw older men talking about going to the X-rated or to the strip clubs. That was normal. It was normal for me to think that, to have boyfriends that had, the girly mags under the bed.
Yeah.
All normalized for me. So
Yeah.
for me as a young girl, what was it like for you as a young boy?
Well, I was born in 1958, so this experience is similar. The primary vehicles for sexually explicit material when I was a child were magazines and movies. And so in the 1960s, when I was very young, there was very little public distribution of pornographic material. That changed with Playboy, Penthouse, Hustler magazines that started to go into wider circulation. Most of us in my friend group knew where our fathers hid those magazines. I can tell you where my father hid his in his dresser drawer. Pornographic movies, which had been underground prior to this, after court decisions became available in public viewing. But of course, this is all before, not only before the computer, but before the DVD, the VHS, which meant that your access to sexually explicit material was through magazines you had to buy in public or movies you had to go to in public. And like most boys, we squirreled away magazines when we found them. We knew where to go to look for, the drugstore would throw out pornographic magazines and we'd go check the dumpster. And a friend of mine figured out how to sneak into the back entrance of the pornographic movie theater in town. So we had those experiences, and they were quite complicated because on the one hand, of course, as someone developing sexuality in your adolescent period, the images are incredibly powerful and you don't really know how to deal with them. Yet there's a certain amount of shame around it. Boys would use the material together, but they would often attack you if they knew you looked at it. So it was a very messy, complex business. Far from the situation today where, as I would talk to students when I was a university professor, the use of pornography, that is, again, just graphic, sexually explicit material, mainly accessed through a computer, was so normalized that people didn't really talk about it very much. There is still, of course, a gender divide. That is, the pornography industry markets its material mainly to men, both straight and gay. There are increasing numbers of women using pornographic material, but it's still largely a male consumer base. And, boys and girls are socialized differently on sexuality more generally, so not surprisingly pornography. But right now what we have is, I would call it a long-running crisis. My friend Gail Dines, who's done some of the most important feminist work on pornography, says we've been running the largest unregulated social science experiment for the last 25 years, where basically we've taken, children and exposed them to graphic, sexually explicit material with no control. When she says it's an experiment, she's, of course, being sarcastic because nobody's trying to study in that sense. It's like a lot of new technologies, new products, new, foods. They get dumped into the culture, and we consume them, often including children. So, I can, just to give you an example, I can remember when the first McDonald's restaurant came into my hometown of Fargo, North Dakota, when I was a teenager. And, in a similar way, we dumped a lot of really tasty, but very in health terms, very dangerous food into the culture and conducted a kind of unregulated experiment. What happens if you raise kids on greasy, salty, fat, sugar? Well, generally good things don't happen. And the porn industry, you can think of it the same way, dumping a product that's very profitable, but the social consequences of it are largely unknown, and what we do know is pretty disturbing.
Yeah, yes, definitely. And I'm thankful. Well, I see a question. Thank you for asking this question, Daniel, I'll go ahead and address it right now. It's always confused me why prostitution is legal in Las Vegas. Like, if it's wrong, why have exceptions?
Well, the sexual exploitation industries, again, prostitution, pornography, the whole range of them, the culture has always had a very conflicted relationship to them. On the one hand, most of it, for most of U.S. history, just stick to the country I live in, these were illegal. But of course, they were accessible. And that's the nature of patriarchy. So by patriarchy, not to sound scary, it's simply another term for institutionalized male dominance. And in patriarchy, there are rules that say thou shalt not access women sexually except in the confines of a marriage. And then there's the reality that men seek out women to use sexually outside of marriage. And so things are illegal but accepted. Las Vegas, don't ask me to explain Las Vegas and its particular social dynamic. I've always thought it's a very odd place where all of the things that we know are socially destructive, excessive drinking, drug use, gambling, and commercial sex are not only allowed, but celebrated, and in fact are the economic basis of the city. So I can't begin to explain Las Vegas and why it's an exception. But more generally, this is the nature of male dominance. There are strict rules that women must follow, roles for women that men control, but secretly, off the books, so to speak, men also use women in other ways. And that's, I think, a good way to think about the sexual exploitation industries. The hypocrisy of a patriarchy that dictates so-called family values and the strict control of women's sexuality, but then turns around in other arenas and buys and sells women's sexuality for male pleasure. Patriarchy is not the only hypocritical system we live with, but it's the one that I think in some ways is most dramatic.
Right. Yes, it's inconsistent. So when we're talking about radical feminists, first let's talk about what is a feminist, because that word is very charged. I know that people have told me, oh, my ex-girlfriend was feminist. And I say, well, what does that mean? Yeah. What is a feminist?
Well, of course, there's different approaches to that. Some people try and take the kind of least common denominator and say, well, feminism is just believing women are equal human beings to men. Oh, okay, that's perfectly fine. But I don't think that gets at the nature of this system we call patriarchy, of institutionalized male dominance for the last, depending on which historian you read, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 years. We've lived with a system of male dominance in politics, in economics, in society. Right? And to me, the simplest way to understand feminism is it's simply a challenge to patriarchy. Not only saying women should be treated like men, but saying that in patriarchy, there are dynamics that must be resisted. The most prominent one, of course, is the domination-subordination dynamic involved in sex. That is male dominance and female subordination. But patriarchy also can be understood as a challenge to all domination-subordination dynamics, not only sexual, but class and race. For me, a feminist critique of dominance, of illegitimate power, leads to a critique of all of those forms of dominance and illegitimate power. Like any other political idea, you will find different articulations of it. But for me, the core of feminism is a challenge to patriarchy, including, the ways that as a man I have privilege in patriarchy, but still believe we should be committed to removing that privilege.
Right. And why is society so deeply threatened when someone decides to challenge or fight back against this normal culture of patriarchy and its behaviors? I don't understand how women can be threatened also When like if I was challenging these behaviors of domination, how can other women be fighting me?
Well, let me give you an analogy. I believe another system of domination is capitalism, an economy based on, greed, self-interest, and rejecting the common interest. Well, I don't happen to agree with that system. And of course, capitalism enriches a number of people, not just the 1%, but, people like me who had good jobs and stable incomes. Right? But capitalism disadvantages large numbers of people. We can call them the working class or poor people or people who never amass capital to create a stable financial security. Well, you'll find defenders of capitalism among the poor and working class. Right? If you didn't, everybody would belong to a union, but not everybody belongs to a union because the ideological power of capitalism, which says we're all responsible for ourselves, and if you're smart and hardworking, you can make it, is very attractive. Okay, so I think I make a point of not trying to tell women what they should think about the world, but one of the most interesting books I think on this subject is a book called Right-Wing Women by the late Andrea Dworkin, who happens to be the feminist most responsible for the critique of pornography we're going to discuss today. And Andrea went into right-wing women's circles, conventions and groups. And she said, these are not women who are just duped. They're well aware of male power, and they're well aware of male sexual violence, male domestic violence. And they've made a decision that for them and their children, that instead of challenging patriarchy, which comes with risks, they are going to secure the safest position for themselves and their children within patriarchy. All right, well, that's a political calculation people can make. Now, Andrea pointed out that, unfortunately, if you think you found a good man and you're married and you have a family and you're safe, she said, the problem is we know that violence exists within those safe, secure families with good, so-called good men. So Andrea's pitch to right-wing women wasn't you're duped and you should become feminists. It's that you've made a calculation that in the end really doesn't protect you because male violence doesn't stop at your front door. And of course, we know perfectly well from the data and decades of experience being reported that women and girls are, in fact, incredibly vulnerable within the home, within the family, within, family circles. So why do people make the political and social choices they make? Well, it's complex. I don't try to read other people's mind. I try to talk about why, as a man, I eventually understood feminism, as you pointed out, not to be a threat to me, but in fact a gift. And not only feminism, but the more radical versions of feminism, the school of thought typically called simply radical feminism.
And how is it a gift?
Well, again, I'll just speak personally. I grew up like many boys, very frightened because one thing about, girls know that boys and men are a threat, but boys also know that boys and men are a threat to each other. The competition and aggression that's normalized in patriarchy plays out in the lives of boys. Now, I happen to have grown up short, skinny, very effeminate, very clumsy, a terrible athlete. In other words, I was nothing like the kind of traditional model of masculinity. As I got older and grew up and, filled out a little bit, I tried to be what I would call a normal guy. So after this childhood of being terrified of boys and men because they were a source of great aggression in my life, I thought, well, now I'm grown up, I can be a real man. And the problem was that didn't make me very happy either. That dominance game in masculinity where everybody tries to be on top, the aggression, whether it's overt or kind of underlying, the incredible competition that patriarchy instills in men. those weren't making me happy as a man in my 20s, even though on the surface I looked now like a normal guy. So when I finally ran into radical feminism and the anti-pornography critique, at the age of 30, it took me a while to get over my fear. Of course, I was socialized to believe feminists were a threat. But once I realized that wasn't the case, I realized feminism gave me a way out of the trap that masculinity sets for men. Some people have referred to the man box, these various pressures that keep men in a box, especially emotionally boxed in. This competition, aggression that shuts men down emotionally. Well, I had lived through all of that. And I realized feminism was, of course, primarily about women's liberation, but it also provided the tools for me to liberate myself from the expectations of masculinity and patriarchy. So I don't want to pretend that was easy. I had to confront myself, my own behaviors, my own assumptions about sexuality. I had learned to be a guy, like most men learn to be a guy, and a lot of that is pretty toxic, and you need to kind of detoxify yourself. So I'm not saying it's been, a joyride. It's been often very painful. I've had to confront my own limitations, my own failures. But as I've been saying now for decades, if you gave me a choice to going back to that game of trying to be a real man or living with the struggles within feminism, well, it's not even a choice. I embrace the struggles in feminism, because trying to be a real man creates incredible threats for girls and women, but in the end doesn't really serve men as well. And I think a lot of what people are talking about now is the problems of boys and men, high levels of suicide, drug use, aggression, all of that kind of stuff, violence. We can't blame those on feminism. Feminism isn't encouraging young men to engage in those behaviors. That's a product of patriarchy. Patriarchy fails men. And, as a quick footnote, unfortunately, a lot of this new concern for boys and men, which I embrace, either avoids or completely rejects a feminist analysis, which is unfortunate, because the best way to understand the problems of boys and men, from my point of view, is through a feminist lens. And unfortunately, the dominant culture is reluctant to do that.
Yes, and they're unaware of. Many people are unaware of that they're being controlled in this patriarchal system. Men are, they're living their whole lives, and it's an empty life, and that's why they are more suicidal. Young men also. It's all based around this corporate patriarchal structure that tells men whether they're worthy or not. And is there at any point you can finally say, well, now I really am a man?
Yeah. Well, first of all, before addressing that, I don't want to pretend, and I know you don't either, that men don't get lots of benefits in patriarchy. Of course, we have advantages. Simply living without the same fear of sexual violence that women live with on a daily basis is a huge difference. Now, by that, I don't mean men aren't victims of sexual violence. They are, but usually at the hands of other men. There are certain advantages in the business world, in politics. For all this talk about how men and boys are at a disadvantage, if you look at the boardrooms of American corporations or the political leadership, it's not that women are absent. It's simply that they're not represented in anywhere near the level that one would expect in a functioning democracy. So men and boys do get benefits, but what we're talking about are the costs. So, just take my own example. I've had professional jobs my entire life. I was a journalist, and then I was a professor. And in every one of those jobs, I was hired by other men. And they understood how to relate to me, and I understood how to relate to them. And again, it's not that women aren't taking some of those positions, but we shouldn't overlook the advantages that patriarchy gives to men, while at the same time speaking very forthrightly about the disadvantages. which are sometimes subtle and harder to see. Just take mental health. As you point out, most men struggle with the fear that they're not man enough. There is a kind of fundamental insecurity in men in a patriarchal society. I grew up with it, feeling it. And again, I was not a traditional kind of tough guy. But what I was really surprised by as I talked to more men over the years is how almost every man I've ever met, including men I thought had it all, the high school quarterback, the rich kid, whatever it was I thought brought happiness, those men also struggled with the fear that they aren't man enough. So the destructive capacity of patriarchy for women and girls is clear. Reduced opportunities, threats of violence, all of that. But the patriarchal system shortchanges men in other ways. And we have to be able to talk about both the ways men benefit from patriarchy, but also the way men suffer in patriarchy. It's complicated, like almost everything else in modern society. It's not a simple black and white where there are, good guys and bad guys. It's much more complex.
Right. Yes. And so in the pornography industry, I mean, we hear a lot of times that men are just visual creatures and women are not like that. Right. And so then that's normal for men to be drawn into this this world of looking at women. So what is this really true, would you say?
Well, certainly it's true, because as we know, women never pay attention to anything visual. They aren't attracted to a certain kind of look or not. At one level, it's just a silly argument, because we're human beings. We all have basically, the same cognitive and emotional makeup. There are differences, obviously, between men and women. The sexual difference in reproduction is not trivial. But this idea that men are somehow fated to use pornography, to use women in prostitution because of our nature, really doesn't hold up. Certainly, under certain conditions, where men are allowed or even encouraged to use women sexually, they will do so. You take constraints away, you make it easy. And there's a simple reason for that, because pornography and other sexual exploitation industries are very good at what they do, which is delivering sexual pleasure without emotional commitment to men. If you simply want to experience sexual pleasure and you don't want the messiness of a human interaction, well, it's hard to find a better way to do that than to open your computer and view pornography for 5 minutes. In other words, pornography works because it does deliver something. It delivers a very intense sexual charge. The question is that the kind of sexuality we want? Not that it isn't, powerful. Everybody understands it is. Otherwise, men wouldn't be at the computer at the rates they are. The question is, though, is that a way to build a holistic sexual life? And my personal experience, as well as my research, suggests that it's not, that you can't really build a healthy, rewarding, fulfilling sexual life, intimate life, emotional life, if you rely on the sexual exploitation industries for pleasure, right? Because it not only provides that physical stimulation, but it shuts you down emotionally. And I think when you condition men's sexual pleasure to that emotion, that kind of very muted emotional experience, there are consequences. That's, I'll refer to the work of a friend of mine who's in Australia, Melinda Tankard-Reist, who wrote a book called They Chose Pornography Over Me, or that's a paraphrase of the title. And it's simply a collection of stories of women, girlfriends, wives in heterosexual relationships who discovered that their husbands had a secret life using pornography. The women felt that was devaluing them, devaluing women in general, and creating a barrier between a healthy intimacy. And when they confronted their boyfriends and husbands the husbands chose pornography over a real live intimate experience. Now, I don't think men come out of the womb preferring a computer screen to a real emotional experience with a woman or with another man in the case of gay pornography. But that's the predictable effect for some men of relying on pornography for sexual excitement and fulfillment. It shuts down other parts of our lives. And that's a cost. It's a cost to women in relationships with these men, but it's also a cost to men ourselves, because I just happen to think, and this is a moral judgment, that a life, an intimate life, is better lived with real people with whom you struggle and sometimes have disputes and sometimes don't get along. That's part of what makes human existence meaningful. It's absolutely true. Pornography is more effective, more efficient in providing sexual pleasure. But then that raises the obvious question. Is that all you want from life, is the efficient delivery of sexual pleasure? It's not all I want. And it's, in my experience, not what most people want.
Right. And what are the young men or the people that you've interviewed, how do they feel after the pornography, after using pornography?
That's interesting, because there's a range of experiences, obviously. Remember, there are 8 billion people on the planet, 4 billion of them are men. So we don't want to pretend there's a single experience. But there are themes and patterns. One is a sense of shame. I certainly felt that growing up. Now, the porn industry wants to say that's just because of, right-wing religious training. But my experience and my research says that's not the case. That when men become aroused and masturbate to pornography, there's a recognition internally that this is a kind of distorted sexuality, that they're interacting with an image on a screen, not a real person. They can see often that the woman on the screen is being sexually denigrated, even, abused. And after the arousal, which kind of overwhelms your own moral judgment, and after orgasm, then you're left with this sense of, what did I just do? I participated in a form of sexuality that's very degraded, both in terms of the experience of women being used, but even in my own experience. And so there is a consistent report of a sense of shame that I don't think is just about, religious doctrine. Okay. Another thing I have noticed is men who simply stay shut down, that to avoid those kind of messy emotions, they just shut off completely. And when the use of pornography becomes so normalized, as we were saying it has in recent decades, it's easy for a lot of men to just say, this is normal, shut down any internal reaction you have to it and move on. But of course, as you well know, you can only shut down unpleasant emotions for so long before they bubble up in other ways. And sometimes they bubble up in very self-destructive ways, I think. If we're lucky, we deal with them through, good friends, therapists, whatever method we do. But I think too often men are suffering, not in the same way women suffer in the way they're used in pornography. Again, we have to make a distinction between the routine sexual degradation of women in the pornography industry and the effects of that, the use of that on men. But I think men do suffer a certain psychological distress when they get looped into these pornographic images. As the computer became more ubiquitous and access to pornography became so easy, in men much younger than myself, we started to hear reports of men who were so using pornography so habitually in an addictive-like fashion that they simply couldn't function sexually except with pornography. And we, probably a decade or so ago, were introduced to a new term, pornography-induced erectile dysfunction, which meant young men, otherwise healthy with no sexual functioning problems, couldn't function sexually with a real woman because their sexual imagination was so tuned to pornography. And there's a whole group of men involved, usually in online discussions, sometimes in person, trying to, through a kind of peer counseling, help each other disconnect from the pornographic world so they can rebuild a healthy sexuality in the real world. All of these things are patterns we see in the effect of pornography use on men. Now, how pornography affects women is an entirely different kind of question, and in some ways much more distressing, scary, and harder to come to terms with, I think, because as women like Andrea Dworkin reminded us, pornography is made with real women. Of course, there's computer-generated images now, but Andrea would remind you, if you see a woman being penetrated by 3 men at the same time while they call her sexualized, degraded names, slap her, pull her hair, spit on her, she said that's happening to a real woman, right? It's a performance in a sense, for the camera, but that's what's really going on. And we know that's why it's quite different than, a Hollywood movie. If you see somebody, get punched really hard in a Hollywood movie, it's fake. It's a stunt. There are actors and stuntmen who do this kind of thing, but that's not the reality of the pornography industry. There are no, stunt women performing sex in some simulated way. This is actual sexual activity. What you see happening to women is actually happening to real women. And the psychological and physical effects of that are now pretty well documented. There's a lot of debate around this. Do women actually choose to be in pornography or in other sexual exploitation industries? And I think that's a complicated question. I'm not saying women don't make choices, but more important are, what are the conditions under which women choose? In other words, if you're 18 years old and you're acting in a pornographic film, what other options did you have? Were you either going to, go into the porn industry or accept a place in the freshman class at Harvard? I mean, usually that's not the choices people are weighing. And so, like a lot of things in this culture where the consequences fall on the least privileged, the people who come from poor backgrounds, who do, quote unquote, the dirty work of a culture. It's usually because they don't have other options. And that's true of the porn industry as well. So we've been talking about the effects of pornography on men, on their sexual imagination, on their capacity to function in relationships, all of which are very important. But we should never forget the reality of women's lives, and first and foremost, the women in the porn industry. And then, of course, the women who are in relationships with men who are using pornography in this kind of way. And there's patterns in that as well.
Yes, it's there are heavy consequences to this, this massive loads of excitement. And what about the young women or young people today that think this is just exciting fun and we're old prudes?
Yeah, I get that a lot. Let me tell you a story about a student who came into my office at the University of Texas, and she was curious about my writing on this subject, and she said exactly what you said. She said, you're an old guy and you don't realize that for the younger generation, porn is just no big deal anymore. Right? And I said, okay, let me ask you a question. She was a heterosexual woman and she was dating and doing things that college students do. And I said, okay, imagine 2 men who are, for all intents and purposes, equivalent in their level of attractiveness, whatever you find attractive, good looks, funny, smart, whatever it is that you find attractive. You have 2 guys and they're basically the same. And there's only one difference. One of them masturbates habitually to pornography and one of them doesn't. I said, which would you rather go out with? And she looked at me funny and said, well, the guy who doesn't use porn, of course. And I said, but wait, you just told me porn is no big deal. Like, why would you prefer a man who doesn't use pornography to one who does, if pornography is no different than watching, a TV sitcom? And she paused and she understood what I was saying. So there was a gap between what young women think they have to say to be cool, to be hip, to be liberated, which is that we don't have a problem with porn because we're sexually, liberated. And then the reality. And I think that's probably still the case. Now, the one thing we're seeing in even younger girls is that pornography, we've talked about how it can shape the male sexual imagination. That when your sexual response, arousal and orgasm, has been conditioned to these images, it can affect what you think is normal, what is sexy. Well, it also affects then girls, either because they've been watching it too, and increasingly women and girls are using pornography more than in the past, but also because what becomes the norm because of those guys' experience. So one thing you'll see is a very dramatic upturn in recent years in boys and young men who want to strangle or choke a woman during sex. Okay, well, where does that come from? Well, I know of no data that suggests that choking women during sex is a long-time sexual practice. It's very recent. And it's recent because it became common in pornography. So if you've seen, since you were 12 years old, men choking women during sex to the point of, potentially the woman blacking out, and that becomes normalized to you, it's not surprising that as a boy or young man, when you first become sexually active in the real world, you replicate that behavior. And we're seeing reports all over the place from rape crisis centers, from child advocates, from sex educators, that they have to talk about why strangulation is not a quote unquote normal sexual practice. Now that, when I was a young kid there was no sex education when I'm so old, there was no sex education when I was a kid. But no one would have thought to say, don't strangle a woman during sex. That's a very recent phenomenon. Okay, so girls and women are functioning in a world where some of these practices are normal and normalized. And that's the consequence. If men have a distorted notion of what quote unquote healthy sexuality is, that's going to affect women as well. And I've a couple of times also added, and gay men as well, because I want to make it clear, the work I've done is primarily in the heterosexual pornographic world, but there's a thriving gay porn industry. And even though you don't have a male-female dominance dynamic, right, you do have top-bottom, the same dominance dynamics are recreated in gay porn. And you see the same consequences in that world as well.
Yeah, this is hard to sit with here. And I do remember in my own experience that my friend came to me, this was probably 20 years ago, and she said, we should get the book, How to Make Love Like a Porn Star.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about how to really create a healthy relationship, but it was how to, do this, this excessive flamboyant style of, if you want to call it, whatever you want to call it, that's something that was glamorized. And I never got the book, but I always thought, gosh, I'm missing something, because this is so... Yeah, and this is what society is teaching. And so when you think about pornography, if you had to ask men, would you choose the word empathy or pornography? I'm sad to say, I feel like most men would say pornography between those two words.
Yeah. Well, I think that your mention of empathy is very important, because in my experience, my research, my reading, my discussions with men, I think the one thing pornography does very consistently is it destroys men's capacity for empathy. Because if you are watching sexually explicit material that is quite intensely cruel and degrading to women, and I'm not giving specific examples because, quite frankly, I find it too distressing to talk about the actual images. I've written about them. I've watched more of them than I ever want to imagine. I actually don't do any new research on pornography because I hit an emotional limit where I simply couldn't bear it anymore. But the cruelty and degradation to women, when I say that, I'm not talking about occasionally calling women a bad name. I'm talking about real sexual humiliation, real violence, and when it's short of real violence, the words cruelty and degradation really do capture the essence of contemporary pornography. Now, can you find sexually explicit material that tries to create loving relationships on film? Sure. But the vast majority of this material is trying to provide the most intense sexual charge possible to attract the most viewers, to make the most money. And so there's a kind of constant intensification of that cruelty and degradation. So, Andrea Dworkin, I mentioned before, whose work was so important, when she wrote her first book on pornography in 1979, it was based on looking at material that today looks almost kind of tame, right? I don't even think Andrea, who died some years ago now, could have imagined the levels of brutality that the pornography industry would normalize. So I'm kind of dancing around the subject because I don't really want to talk about the nature of those images. But that has now become the baseline for sexual stimulation for entire generations of men. And to think that has no consequences either for men's psychology or for the experiences of girls and women is just a fantasy. And I think one of the reasons we don't talk about this so much, and when we do, it tends to be from a kind of critical, conservative, religious, moralistic point of view, right? And I want to make it clear, I'm not critiquing pornography because I think it's evil or immoral or against the Bible. I mean, people may have those ideas and that's fine. But this is a feminist critique about the consequences of flooding a culture with this kind of sexually explicit material. It has effects on men, it has effects on women. And we're starting to document this in ways that are really impossible to deny. Yet the culture does deny it. But, contemporary culture is good at denial of a lot of things. We're on the brink of an ecological collapse that's kind of hard to fathom, and yet we deny it every day. So in some sense, there's nothing unusual about culturally, collectively, a society turning away from difficult truths like this. But that doesn't make them any less dramatic, disturbing, distressing. And what we do is force people to deal with it privately, individually, instead of trying to deal with it collectively. And that's the real sad part, because you don't solve social problems individually. You solve social problems socially by bringing them out in the open. Whatever progress we've made on race relations, let's say, Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, all of them currently under assault, but that's a different story. But that wasn't done privately. That was done collectively, socially, in public, forcing a culture to face difficult social realities. And we need to do the same thing here. It's not pleasant, it's not easy, but it's inevitably necessary.
Definitely. And Daniel's saying we are stewards in all senses. Thank you both for the stream. Yeah, thanks for watching. Yeah, and so let's talk in our last few minutes here. How do we get out of this mess? If there's a young man that's like shut down empathy and is addicted to this and is not able to have relationships with women, what can he do?
Well, I think there are a lot of different perspectives on that. As I mentioned, some people find a religious path to rejecting this kind of material. I don't happen to be a religious person. If people take that path, good luck to you. I hope it's helpful. Obviously, therapy. Now, that's an individual solution, but it's often a very powerful one and one I've benefited from. So I encourage anybody, men, women, anybody, but especially men struggling with this, to seek out competent, sensitive mental health professionals, where it's often easier to talk honestly about what you're afraid of. Because one thing about patriarchy is men are often afraid to talk about what they're afraid of. And so therapy is part of it. But I don't see a real escape from this without a feminist analysis. So I encourage men to read feminism, to engage in that exploration of an idea. Now, the only thing I know for sure is if men find themselves in this addictive-like relationship with pornography, they recognize that it's hurting their themselves psychologically, hurting their relationships with women and other men. The only thing I know for sure is if you try to quit alone, you'll fail. It's not something that we can do by ourselves. And so I encourage, especially younger men, I'm now 68 years old and I don't really know how to talk to an 18-year-old. There's a half a century of experience that separates us. But discussion groups, book groups, anywhere you can get men together where we can drop the facade, the kind of macho posturing. And sometimes you just have to try and create those spaces. And wherever that happens, something good will come of it. But it's not easy, right? Because you're not only saying, I'm concerned about how I use pornography, you're really saying, I'm concerned about how I was socialized to be a man. And not only pornographic sex, but sex more generally. You have to take apart all of the training you have. And that's why I said earlier that embracing feminism isn't easy. I would never say to somebody, oh, it's a piece of cake. Just go read a feminist book, make some feminist friends, and everything will be fine. It won't be. It will be a struggle. But the reward on the other side of that struggle are really quite profound. And so, I'm not contending I have completely eliminated all of my patriarchal training any more than I would say I've completely eliminated all of my, training to be white. Or we are the product of the societies we come from. But I can tell you that if you said to me, listen, you can go back to being a man again, without all of this struggle, it's just not an attractive proposition, because my relationships with other men, with women, are deeper and richer and more meaningful than they were when I was struggling with, that how to be a man question. And for me, probably the most profound and important person was another man who helped me understand this, who let me, fail and stumble, who didn't condemn me if I made a mistake. And those kind of relationships are priceless. So, I think men can learn a lot from women, but in the end, men also have to help each other, because it's only with other men, I think, that we really can find a path to letting go to some of these very, very destructive masculinity habits that we picked up along the way.
Very true. Yes. And so y'all, please subscribe if you're watching. Next week, our show is going to be 15 minutes later, 15. So let's hear about your upcoming book, Bob.
Well, that's another, I tend to gravitate toward projects that are kind of curious and offbeat, but this is an attempt to merge the personal and the philosophical. As I said, I'm not a religious person. I'm not even a spiritual person. I've come to a certain sort of philosophical position in the world that some people find rather harsh. And so the question is, how did I get here? And so the first part of the book is a memoir about the very disturbing childhood I lived through with an abusive alcoholic father and a psychologically destructive mother, trying to take seriously the reality that we're not just rational beings. We don't just think about things and come to decisions. We're the product of this really complex interaction of the emotional and the rational, of the cognitive and the psychological. And it's my attempt at this kind of late point in my life to make sense of, I guess you could say it's a book about how did I end up being such a weird guy? But what I found is every time I think I'm a weird guy, I find, well, there's a lot of other people who are weird too. And so I think, the more we talk about the peculiar nature of our own lives, which we may think are idiosyncratic, but usually turn out to be fairly common, we can make progress. So that's this most recent book. And if the title, This I Don't Believe, doesn't make sense, go and do a search for the phrase "This I Believe," and you'll figure out where the title came from. I'll leave that as a mystery for people to explore on their own.
And that's coming out in September, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, great. So everyone can, where can people find you? On your, what's your webpage?
Just Google my name, Robert Jensen. If you spell my last name right, my page will be the first one that comes up. And all of the articles I've written are archived there, information about books, a way to contact me for anybody who wants to follow up with more questions. So it's all there on the web. Like in our lives, everything is on the web. You're not real if you're not on the web. So I'm there.
Okay. All right. Well, y'all, I want to thank, first, of course, I want to thank you, Bob. I want to thank Daniel Broccoli and YouTube 1970. And yes, all this wisdom that you gave us and a lot of things to reflect on and in our own upbringing and how we came to think about pornography and how we can make a difference and embrace feminism as a gift and to be ready to talk about it. So thank you so much, Bob. I appreciate this.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Very, very grateful you wanted to have the conversation. So thanks again.
Well, thank you. And y'all, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye, everyone.